If you have your Bibles, and you'd better take it and open up to the book of Psalms. We're going to be in Psalm 2, but I want to read Psalm 1 and 2. So we will read Psalm 1, pay attention to Psalm 2. As you're turning there, let me ask you a question. So this is what I asked Wednesday Conversations. What is the stupidest thing you've ever witnessed a person doing? Keep in mind, anything that comes to mind that you've seen me do was entirely for anticipating this day in this question. So those don't count. Now, he's home sick today, Jared, our bass player. Now, I'm not saying that's the providence of God, but he couldn't be here today to answer that question with anything I've done in the 12 or 13 years we've been friends. So nobody asked Steffo about anything stupid you've ever seen me do. What's the stupidest thing you ever heard somebody say? Just flat out dumb. Now, there's intentional stupidity. Maybe it was a joke. But there's also often non-intentional stupidity. And what we're going to see today in Psalm 2 is that the people, the nations, you and I probably on some level, are going to say and attempt to do something very, very dumb. We'll get to that. First, a little background on the Psalms, because I preached Psalm 1 here before, but that was in November. So it's been almost a year. A little background on the Psalms. What is a psalm? A psalm is essentially a song or a poem put to music. It was composed for expressing human emotion towards God, towards Israel's God, usually in contemplation, thinking about something, or very often a plea and a prayer put poetically and then to music oftentimes. And the book of Psalms is a 150 edited and ordered collection of these prayers and pleas put to music that we now call the book of Psalms. And they basically consisted of Israel's hymnal for worship, you might say. Wasn't there the only songs that they sung, because the Old Testament in particular has a lot of different other songs that they did and would sing on occasion. But this was a very formalized book for 150 songs to sing throughout their, might say, liturgical calendar, the Jewish religious calendar of their day. And it's subdivided into 5 books. Books 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are the subdivisions of all. This thing is moving like crazy. Was it moving on you, Karen? Was? Okay, so it's not just me. Is it the plate? We'll figure that out. That feels steadier. Okay, so 5 books to the Psalms, but the structure of the Psalm is very deliberate. The books and Psalms individually are collected and edited, compiled, and put together in the way that they are to help make theological points. The book of Proverbs is the same way. These are not accidental. They are ordered for a reason. Psalms 1 and 2 were not originally written to be right next to each other in a book of Psalms, but they are now, and they're put there for a very deliberate reason, which is why we're going to read them both together. These 2 Psalms together are often called gateway Psalms by some scholars, and it just means that all of the major themes of the book of Psalms can be found in the first 2 Psalms, most of them anyways. Because of that, they're edited to be an introduction to the book as a whole, as well as to book 1 of the Psalms, which runs Psalm 1 through 41. That's book 1 of the Psalms. And Psalm 1 and 2, Psalm 1 opens, "Blessed are those who do this," and Psalm 2 closes, "Blessed are all who take refuge in him," forming an inclusio, a bookend, as a literary device to say, I want you to actually read and pay attention to these Psalms together. Even if they weren't originally intended for that, we're tracking on some theological ideas that we want you to comprehend. So here's a very obvious way to do it. They use this Hebrew word ashrei that we translate blessed, and it's not the typical word for blessing. It's a much rarer word saying, hey, we're deliberately doing this, pay attention. And that would be unmistakable in Hebrew, that they've done that. We just translate the word, we get blessed, and we have blessed in a lot of our music and our songs, and so we kind of overlook the fact that we're supposed to be grouping these together. So let's bring them together. We're going to read them together. Psalm 1 is a basic introduction that says all people have two paths in front of them. You've got the righteous path of God, and you've got the wicked path of being against God. The righteous conform to God's will by thoroughly and thoughtfully seeking after Him in this long-term investment, and the wicked destroy themselves completely in the end by the pursuit of short-term gain. That's Psalm 1. Psalm 2 takes this individual idea of what is blessing and how do you get it, and then expands it not just to individual peoples, but to the nations and people groups, all languages, tongues, and tribes. And we see that the nations are going to be on the side of the wicked, but perhaps they have the opportunity to change their destinies and their fates if they will actually do something in Psalm 2. We'll get to that. So Psalm 2's content is basically this: those who wish to lead the blessed life must stop rebelling against God's anointed king. And if you do that, you can at least potentially have the blessed life. So let's read Psalm 1, and then we'll go straight on into Psalm 2, no breaks, and read, 20 verses altogether, and then we'll focus on Psalm 2. The beginning of the book of Psalms says, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or take the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on His law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yield its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither, and whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked; they are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and the rulers band together against the Lord and against His anointed, saying, 'Let's break the chains and throw off their shackles.' The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in His anger and terrifies them in His wrath, saying, 'I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, "You are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, and the ends of the earth your possessions. You will break them with the rod of iron, or you will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and celebrate His rule with trembling. Kiss His Son, or He will be angry, and your way will lead to your destruction, for His wrath can flare up in any moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in Him." Now, Psalm 2 is an interesting psalm, and the reason I was thinking through this psalm is because I just finished this book on the First World War. You know, I'm 36, and by the time you hit 35, every man has to pick a war to obsess about. And so I picked the First World War because I didn't know anything about it. And it's a great example of when leaders lead badly and lead astray, because the entire continent of Europe got embroiled in that war because of a few key leaders desiring more power or more economic prosperity, different ways of looking at this. In Psalm 2, the same thing is very much happening, because it's addressing kings, officials, leaders, the high up, and decisions they're making, and inevitably dragging all of their people behind them to make these national decisions. In Psalm 2, the nations are aligned to do something very, very dumb, very, very futile. They're going to try to fight against God's rule. And since no actual action can be taken to stop God from ruling, the psalmist boils it down to this: they're just going to vocalize a lot of complaints against God and a lot of intentions to do anti-God things, but they're never really going to get around to it. So it's going to be very, very vocal problems that you see the psalmist going through here. They're going to speak defiantly against the God they hate, but they're not really going to actually do anything. So God is going to speak to them about His intentions, and He's going to make His intentions known to them. Then the king He appoints to lead the nations is going to speak, and then that king is going to give all the nations a choice. The psalm breaks up into 4 basic stanzas, each with 3 verses. 3 verses. Stanza 1 is the first 3 verses of the Psalms. The vocal nations are going to speak out against God. So the psalm opens with this rhetorical question of like the psalmist just opening and saying, why? Why are the nations raging? What is their problem? Why are they acting this way? Why struggle in vain? Why fight a battle you cannot possibly win? Verses 2 through 9 are going to tell us why they're struggling and why they hate the path that God wants them to be on. But the opening emphasizes the surprise of the psalmist to say, I'm looking around and I'm seeing the nations fighting a battle they can't possibly win. It doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that? And he's going to seek to answer his own questions as he writes this psalm. Now, the first 2 verses kind of play a numbers game. It's all the nations and all these kings, and it's speaking very hyperbolically to set the stage, but it's kings and officials, which is plural language in the Hebrew, and then it's God, singular, and his anointed, singular. It's like 2 people versus all the people. The anointed king in verse 2, that is the word Messiah in Hebrew. This is a messianic psalm. I'm not really going to talk much about what messianic psalms are or why they're important this time around, but a simplified version is this. Anything that refers to David in the Psalms has the potential to refer to every son of David after him until we get to the ultimate son of David, Jesus, the Christ, the Greek word for Messiah. So the New Testament authors are tracking on this, and they're reading the Psalms very messianically because the messianic language in the Psalms is very direct, as in 2:2 of this book. Now, it's God, it's Messiah versus all the nations. And if it was just strictly a numbers game, God would be at an obvious disadvantage in the fight. But, of course, it's not a numbers game when you're trying to battle against Almighty God. What are these numerous nations doing against God in verse 1? The NIV phrases it, they're raging, they're plotting. Some of your translations may something saying they're murmuring, they're scheming, they're vocalizing these intentions. Hey, let's defy God. Let's do things our own way. We know what God wants. We don't want to do it. What else can we do? And they're trying to come up with a plan. They don't actually lift a weapon against God. I mean, how could they? The nations are here in the psalm, all talk and no action. Which is, not great for a person to be. A righteous person certainly cannot be all talk and no action. But perhaps a wicked person can be. When you can't lift a weapon against somebody stronger than you, when you can't physically fight them, like the nations with God, what course do we usually end up taking? Being very loud, boisterous, and vocal against people, complaining, rebellion, being as vocal against the fact that you might be in charge, but we don't like the situation. You ever come across that in politics? We lift our voices, we complain, we rebel, as they're doing in the psalm. And when we find ourselves determined to be against God, this is basically our only recourse of action. You can't stop him. You can't stop him from being king. You can't stop him from ruling. So you get loud and boisterous about it. And it leads to, in verse 3, their speech being vocalized, their ultimate desire. Let's live autonomously from God. Let's throw off the chains. Let's gain freedom. The NIV translates that word chains. A more literal translation of that would actually be the word fetters. If you know the hymn, and I've just spaced on the Come Thou Fount. Thank you, Hannah. If you know the phrase Come Thou Fount in verse 3, it uses the word fetters, bind my heart, whatever the specific language is, like a fetter. A fetter was the rope that you would use to bind and tie cattle, to domesticate and train your animals. And here they're using the words to say, God, we think God treats us like cattle. We're suspicious of God. We don't like him. How dare he bind us? And the best thing that we can do for ourselves is throw off the shackles and the chains. But God didn't make us cattle. Humanity is being very, very silly here. Their collective declaration, let's throw off these chains that shackle us, is what the psalmist says in verse 1, it's vain. It's purposeless. There's no point to it. You're not going to succeed. God didn't make us to be cattle. He made us to be the kings and queens of the world who get to rule underneath his authority, yet alongside him in this life. That's what it means to be an image bearer. You have a right to choose and make decisions, and those decisions are supposed to be in line with God, guiding the creation to its ultimate intentions underneath him. But instead, like these people in the Psalms, our declaration of intent is, let's just rebel and do things our own way. It's very much the decision Adam and Eve are making in Psalm 3. Let's decide for ourselves what the knowledge of good and evil is. What are we going to call good? What are we going to call evil? Let's not let God make those decisions anymore. Let's make them ourselves. And it turns out we're not as good as God at leading, ruling, and guiding the world. Not as good as he is. And that should be obvious, but we need to stop every once in a while and remember it. Now, part of the reason I wanted to read Psalm 1 with Psalm 2 is because there's this linguistic connection to Psalm 1, verse 2, where the righteous person meditates on the law of the Lord, his instructions. He's meditating, thinking it through, cognitively processing it, bringing it to mind day and night. In Hebrew, that language is actually the language of muttering and murmuring. Because in Hebrew, when you were learning something, they weren't exactly written people. They were more oral communicators. So you would communicate and repeat things out loud over and over again as a memory device and processing it. The idea for meditation there is that same thing. Well, the language of what the nations are doing here, and they're murmuring and they're plotting and stuff, is the same language. But they're doing it for the completely wrong reasons. They don't like God, they don't want to know what he has to say, and they don't care. So their mind and their voices are dwelling on all the wrong things, and it's leading them to do all the wrong things. Ultimately welling up in that declaration of intent, let's throw off the chains, let's defy God, let's be our own gods. Same thing as Genesis chapter 3. When we consistently dwell on these negative thoughts, they can't help but be vocalized. And when we consistently dwell on thoughts of defying God, that naturally leads to doing bad things, rebelling in some way, shape, and form. But the person who is constantly on God's side is the one who's constantly thinking about his teachings and vocalizing those thoughts naturally. The same is true for those who resist and rebel against God. They dwell on their rebellion and the things that they want to do, and then they go out and they make them happen. The things that we think about and we let into our mind, we are letting into our very selves, our souls. If you let in the wrong things, you will be eventually acting in the wrong direction. And you will have God's response applied to you the way that he responds to the nations as a whole in the second stanza, verses 4 through 6, where God vocalizes his response to the nations. He says, he laughs, he scoffs at them, he rebukes them in his anger, terrifies them, and he says, I've installed my king on Zion. So in the second stanza, in each of these stanzas, the scene is going to shift. The POV is going to shift. You get the psalmist asking a question as he's observing, and then the nations on earth are giving their declaration of intent at the end, and then the scene shifts to heaven where God's sitting enthroned, and we get his little amused response. So we go from earth to heaven. We're going to go back to earth in just a second. But God's response to this is a little bit funny. It's amusement to start with, and then it's anger. He laughs, he scoffs, he rebukes, and he terrorizes. There's a progression there. Laughter is kind of like, I don't take the one... You humans take yourselves way too seriously. I don't take you that seriously. But let me just declare that your power is nothing to mine. I scoff at the idea that you're powerful at all. stop rebelling against me in rebuke, or terror will be the only thing that you know. There's a progression of ideas here. And the psalm is going to play that out. So God sits enthroned in a place that humans cannot reach, this POV from heaven. And even with all of humanity united against his will, God is under approximately 0% threat to his reign, which is why it's laughable that all of us together would try to challenge God. But if we're going to have that attitude towards God, the natural response is going to be God rebuking or terrorizing us. God filling us with terror. Because he is too good of a person, of a being, to rebel against without consequence. He is too good to let these consequences of our decisions to rebel against him to go unpunished. So if you think that God is only amused by your actions and antics and silly words, he's not just amused, he's actually going to try and get you back on the right path. But if you refuse to get on the right path and stay on the wrong path, you can see a much stronger side of God than the laughter and the amusement. He can fill you with terror, or he can fill you with reverent fear and awe, but we'll come to that in just a second. But, when we know that we're setting ourselves up against God, the truth is, we know we're setting ourselves up to fail. We might live in denial about it, but we know we cannot win the fight. And when we're so determined to fight it anyways, there's nothing left for God to do but to actually end us, destroy us, terrorize us, judge us. Pick your description. Before he actually gets to that point, he tells humanity in verse 6, this is my declaration. All right, verse 3, the first stanza ends with a declaration of intent. Verse 6 mirrors that by ending with God's declaration of intent. Or at this point, not even his intent, just what he's done. My Messiah will rule in Zion. Zion is a word for Jerusalem. It can refer to either the physical city of Jerusalem or just in a more broad sense, the physical or the people of God in a very general sense. It doesn't have to mean physical Jerusalem. Here, it does mean physical Jerusalem. The Davidic king rules from Jerusalem at the time this psalm is being written, and it's being used in worship. So, Zion here does mean Jerusalem, and God says, my response to your choice is, I've set my ruler up to rule over you. I will remain ruler in the heavens, but my chosen human person will rule on earth. That's the solution to your rebellion, nations. How does that work? How does it solve the world's rebellion by putting a king in Jerusalem? He doesn't just put a king there in Jerusalem. He makes that king the king of kings, so that all these nations, tribes, and tongues are meant to follow and bow down to him, the one they're trying to rebel against. Which is what is stated in verses 7 through 9. The Messianic king in this third stanza is going to rule the nations. That's God's will. It's going to happen. So we get from the end of the second stanza of God's declaration in heaven, and we get back to earth as our point of view changes again. And the Messianic king himself is going to speak. God's human representative on earth, the Messiah, is going to talk. And he says, I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son, today I become your father. Ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possessions. You will break them with a rod of iron and dash them to pieces like pottery. That language in verse 7 of God's decree, I will tell of the Lord's decree, is language of a binding legal contract. It's kind of like the word covenant, but it's a little bit different, but it's no less legally legitimate. And verse 7 summarizes the contract. God declares that the line of David is his line of sonship, his kings. Sonship is language for king. Messiah is language for king. This is all ancient language for king. Okay, this is not about whether Jesus is ontologically God or not. That may be very, very true. This verse is not directly going to get you there. This is about kingship and how God views kingship as a solution to our rebellion. He's going to anoint someone to be his human representative on earth. In the ancient Near East, kings would have lots of sons, but only one could be anointed as the future king. So that specific son would gain the title of firstborn, whether he was born first or not. You get the title of firstborn. It means that regardless of actual birthing order, you possess more authority than your actual siblings. And eventually you will possess the throne of your father, and his authority will be passed along to you. Paul uses this language of Christ in Colossians chapter 1, where he calls Christ the firstborn. It's a title for authority and gaining authority. In Exodus, Israel collectively as a nation, Exodus 4:22, I believe it is, says, "Go and tell Pharaoh, Israel is my firstborn. They're my nation. They're my representatives to you." And the way it works is God has Israel as his firstborn representative nations, and then you have all the other nations defying God down here. This is the fundamental problem in the Old Testament. And then of all the Israelite nations, you have, tribes, not nations. You have the tribe of Judah being the line of kings. And of all the tribes, Judah's the kingly line. And of all the families in Judah, it's David's line that gets to be picked. And of all the sons of David, they all get the chance to fulfill this, but they all fail. This is the book of Kings. This is the book of Chronicles. They're constantly doing something. No matter how good they often are, even David fails, as do all of his sons, until we turn the page from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and we get the story of a Davidic son who passes every test when he's led into the wilderness, does everything that Israel was supposed to do, and ultimately, as Colossians 2 says, surrenders his life up to God in obedience, even to death on a cross. So Jesus got right what everyone gets wrong, including the Davidic sons. Because of that, God gave him the name above every name. God gave him the authority above all authority. That at his name, at his authority, every knee would bow and every tongue would confess that he is God, to the glory of God the Father. This solves the world's problem. So this is the gospel in a nutshell, extending out of Psalm 2. The firstborn son of the firstborn nation is meant to rule all the nations. So, in verse 8, the nations themselves become the Messiah's inheritance. Somehow the people rebelling in verses 1 through 3 are going to become subjects of the king that God establishes in Jerusalem. And that's going to deal with the world's problems. The question is, what is the Messianic king going to do with a bunch of rebellious children squawking the entire time about wanting to not do what he wants and go their own way? What is the Messiah going to do with a bunch of rebellious people? Verse 9 says they can be broken and destroyed by the Messiah, or they can be shepherded by him. And this idea of the Messiah actually shepherding the nations probably doesn't come out in most of our English translations. The NIV in verse 9 translates them, he will break them with an iron rod. You could translate that, he will shepherd them with an iron rod. Probably most of us in here are familiar with Psalm 23, where he says, his rod and his staff will comfort me. The rod is a shepherd's rod. It's not necessarily a tool for punishment, though it can be. It could be a tool for defense against threats to the sheep, but it can double as a disciplinary weapon if it needs to. There's ambiguity to how you have to read verse 9. The ambiguity makes it possible, and is probably deliberate enough, to imply the choice. Everyone gets to choose. What do you want from this king? Do you want him to destroy you, or do you want him to shepherd and guide you? That's the choice. The language of break, he can break them with an iron rod, is actually very, very close, if not in some translations the same word, as shepherd. The Hebrew is hard to understand, but it knows what it's doing poetically here. It's being ambiguous so that you know you have a choice. The rebel nations have a choice to make. You and I have a choice to make. Do you want the king to guide you to the correct living and to ultimate glory? Or do you want to keep rebelling until he has to destroy you? That choice is ours to make. David's royal line, through the Son of David yet to come, when this psalm is being written, the book of Psalms is being compiled, we turn to the New Testament and we're told this is, of course, Jesus Christ. He is God's representative to rule over the nations in verse 7. Verse 8, he's the highest power over all nations regarding their rebellion. I mean, this is the end of the book of Matthew. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. This psalm is fulfilled. But in verse 9, he's the destroyer of the nations and the powers that go on defying him, or else he's the shepherd to get people where God wants them to be. The difference is decided based on people's choice to submit or to rebel. The vocalizing of the nations in stanza 1 says, our intention is to rebel. So God comes along and says, well, my intention is that my king is going to rule. And then the king himself speaks and he says, I can destroy you or I can guide you. And then we move on to the fourth and final stanza, verses 10 through 12, and the choice before you and I, where the psalm now comes full circle and closes where it opens with the rebel nations. Probably the Messianic king is still talking here, and he speaks to the nations to explicitly give them the choice, serve me or be destroyed. Verse 10 through 12 follow this short set of a short imperative commands. Be warned, be wise, serve, kiss. Verse 10, the ones who rebel in their speech at the beginning are essentially warned to keep silent now. Be warned. Maybe you just want to be quiet. Not a bad piece of wisdom, honestly. Maybe the world doesn't need us to always open our mouths and say something just because we could. Because oftentimes, like the rebel nations, the thing that comes out of our mouths is not great. So the first piece of advice in verse 10 is, maybe don't talk, maybe just listen. A very good, strong piece of advice. But if you're going to speak, how do you speak? How do you use your voice? We'll come to that in just a second. The idea of being silent is, hey, gain a little bit of sense here. Allow yourself to be placed back on the correct path. Don't open your mouth. Don't argue. Let yourself be corrected. And we all know that a wise person can learn from anyone, regardless of their office or their station. Anybody that can help them walk a good and godly path, a wise person is willing to learn from them no matter how low they are. But very rarely do leaders, kings, and presidents like being rebuked by other people, because they're the top of the hierarchy. But even they can understand when it's necessary. You need to listen to the rebuke. Here, they're actually at the top of a human hierarchy, except for the Messiah, but the Messiah himself is representing the hierarchy of God in heaven. They're not the highest authority. They have someone else above them they could be listening to, as does every nation, tribe, tongue, president, leader, and king today. Those looking to rebel in verse 3, that are looking to throw off the constraints of instruction, are looking to throw off the very thing that's actually designed to keep them alive and on God's good path in life. Reject that at our own peril. The advice is sound. If you're off the path, listen to God's rebuke and come back on the path, even if you're an entire nation going astray. Those who allow themselves to be put back on the right path get to take certain actions in verse 11. 1, serve. Leaders, even kings, are not exempt from service because they stand at the top of the human hierarchy. The one at the top of the hierarchy who can lead properly is the one who recognizes God's authority above them and implements that authority. And in whatever way, shape, or form you operate, if you're a boss at work, if you're head of your household, whatever place you as an image bearer have authority, you're supposed to recognize God's authority and be implementing his authority to those under your authority. Authority is not evil. We just use it in bad ways. The shepherd here, the Messiah, could shepherd us to actually use our authority in better ways. And if we recognize it, we do the second action here in verse 11. Celebrate with trembling, or instead of trembling, with reverence. Celebrate and be joyful, but also a healthy caution of God would not be a bad thing for each and every one of us to learn. The Old Testament tells us to fear God. In fact, the entire Bible, there's only one thing we're ever supposed to fear, and that's God. This is the language of fearing God. Reverence, awe to someone so much greater, more powerful, and beyond us that all we can do is bow and obey. That is the language here. It comes from knowing that we're accountable to a greater authority, Him. In this case, that the authority is the Messiah Himself, the Son, which is why verse 12 says, kiss the Son. This is a shorthand language for an ancient Near Eastern practice where when you submitted to a higher authority than yourselves, you often would kneel down and kiss their feet. If a king conquered you, they might make you do this, but here it's being offered up willingly. It's like if you ever watched The Godfather and they say you got to kiss his ring. It's kind of the same thing. You got to recognize that you're under somebody else's authority. Kissing the Son is a political symbol of the humility it takes to do that. And to the person who can do that, you can be blessed. So, kissing the Son means, maybe do something with your mouth other than vocalize your rebellion. Maybe if you're not going to be quiet and you're going to keep on listening, you're going to be destroyed. But if you want to actually not be destroyed, maybe stop talking. And then what you actively do with your mouth is actually a little bit different. Show subservience to this king. Show homage to him. Give him what he wants. So the poem closes by warning the kings of the earth not to utter vain words of rebellion against the universal King of heaven and God's chosen king in Zion. Instead, those kings are adjured to employ their mouths more appropriately in an act of silent submission. And if you can do that, you get to the very last verse of this psalm, verse 12. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. The closing line here was probably not originally part of the psalm. It was probably deliberately added to form the bookend with the opening of Psalm 1. Blessed is the one, ending with blessed is the one here. Or blessed are all who take refuge in him. Again, that Hebrew word is a rare word for blessing. It's a very deliberate choice that they're making in the editorial process so that you can and will read them together. The one who gains the blessings of Psalm 1, the wise and righteous person, or the people who submit to God in Psalm 2, corporately, as a group, are the same people doing the same things, letting their minds dwell on God, letting it take into Him, and using their mouths to actually submit to the Son and follow His will and His reign, instead of constantly disobeying and rebelling. So, submit to God by obeying, not rebelling, against God's chosen king. And I'm here to tell you that today, that king is Jesus. And just listen to the Psalm's warning and be wise. Look, you can't defeat God. It's not going to happen. If it's His will against yours, you're going to lose. I'm going to lose. You're going to lose if we decide we're going to fight that out with God. The best thing is actually to submit, celebrate, and serve His will, not our own, and learn to actually consider what He says and wants better than what we think. This path leads to life in verse 12, and our personal wills lead to destruction at the very last part of verse 12. So be warned, you don't have unlimited time to make this choice. You came in here today and you were constantly, if you're already in a state coming here today, constantly choosing to do things your own way. Ask yourself, how is that working out for me? Do I even like my life? Maybe the reason is because you're not connecting with God. You're not connecting with God because you're defying Him all the time. If you can do something about this. See, the good news of the psalm is that your own troubles are almost entirely your own fault. And because they are, we can do something about our own faults. We can do something about our own choices. But it's a big sacrifice. You have to give up control over to God. That's what this psalm is calling us for. So are you going to go on doing the stupid thing of fighting against God? And are you going to go on saying stupid things of saying, I can rebel against God and be the one person that succeeds in it? Or are you going to do the wise thing? And are you going to surrender to His kind and kingly will? The choice is yours. And I leave you with that choice this morning.